Green Lake, a small mountain town in the state of Oregon, was renowned for its tranquil atmosphere and the close-knit bonds shared by its residents. Here, time seemed to slow down, and each day unfolded with the rhythm of ordinary life, where surprises were rare. The community was made up of hardworking, simple people who genuinely believed that family, faith, and mutual support were life's greatest values. At the heart of this quiet town stood the Rivers family, a moral and spiritual beacon for many. Matthew Rivers, a 42-year-old pastor, had an impeccable reputation. His sermons, always profound yet simple, drew large crowds of parishioners. People trusted his words, viewing him not only as a spiritual leader, but also as a moral compass. He was always ready to listen, offer support, and find the right words for anyone seeking his guidance. Matthew's wife, Kate, was his steadfast partner in every endeavor. At 38, she was known for her ability to organize church events and maintain a harmonious home. Although she appeared calm and kind, her eyes often betrayed a subtle inner tension, something she carefully concealed from those around her. The Rivers family had three children. Grace, the eldest daughter at 16, was diligent and disciplined. She actively participated in school events and was regarded as one of the top students. The middle child, 14-year-old Oliver, stood out for his curiosity and thirst for adventure, while the youngest, 10-year-old Lily, charmed everyone with her sincerity and unfiltered joy. Everyone in Green Lake viewed the Rivers family as the epitome of perfection. Their two-story home with its well-kept porch symbolized family warmth and comfort. On weekends, friends and neighbors often gathered there to chat or discuss community matters. Sunday dinners were especially significant as they were attended by George Rivers, Matthew's 65-year-old father. George was a veteran of the local church and a respected elder, admired for his lifelong devotion to faith and his wise counsel. Outwardly, the family seemed harmonious, but beneath the facade of their ideal life lay hidden tensions. Kate always appeared uneasy in George's presence. Her movements became stiff, and her voice lost its usual confidence. However, this behavior went unnoticed by others, easily attributed to the fatigue of her responsibilities as a mother and homemaker. One evening during their traditional family dinner, Grace excitedly shared her latest school project on genetics. Her enthusiasm for the subject was genuine and contagious. As part of her project, she proposed that the entire family take a DNA test to explore their ancestry. At first glance, it seemed like an innocent idea, sparking curiosity and excitement among everyone. The suggestion piqued everyone's interest. Oliver immediately began imagining the possibility of discovering famous ancestors, while Lily, fueled by her brother's imagination, eagerly supported the idea. Matthew praised his daughter for her inquisitiveness and thirst for knowledge, fully endorsing her plan. However, Kate, who had been quietly listening up to that point, suddenly turned pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised her glass of water. She attempted to object, saying the tests were unnecessary, but her words went unheard. The DNA tests were ordered, and a sense of anticipation settled over the Rivers household. No one could have foreseen that this seemingly simple idea would serve as the catalyst for events that would irrevocably alter their lives. Beneath the flawless surface of their family life, a hidden threat was already brewing, one that no one could yet predict. The results of the DNA test proposed by Grace became the key turning point that set off a chain reaction of events. Initially, the idea seemed intriguing and even entertaining. Oliver dreamed of discovering connections to historical figures, while Lily, with her vivid imagination, pictured herself as a distant relative of royalty. Matthew supported his daughter's initiative, emphasizing how important it was to know their roots. However, Kate's reaction stood out distinctly. Her face grew pale, and the tension in her voice became evident. Despite her unease, no one seemed to pay attention to her nervous state. Matthew dismissed her faint objections, joking that the test would reveal something new and exciting. After a brief discussion, the decision was made. The test would be ordered, and everyone agreed to submit their samples. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the Rivers household was light and filled with anticipation. Grace was deeply immersed in her school project, gathering information on genetic inheritance and famous genealogical discoveries. Oliver and Lily occasionally joked about the unexpected revelations the test might bring. Only Kate seemed to avoid the topic, burying herself in endless household chores. When the results finally arrived, the family gathered in the living room. The lighthearted buzz of conversation and laughter gradually gave way to silence as Matthew opened his laptop to view the laboratory report. Grace sat beside him, eagerly awaiting the insights the test might reveal. At first, it seemed like an entertaining game. Grace enthusiastically read out details about their ethnic heritage, commenting on the various percentages of their lineage. Matthew, Oliver, and Lily laughed, discussing the unexpected facts that appeared on the screen. The atmosphere remained lighthearted until they reached the section about familial relationships. In one line, printed in clear, unambiguous text, it stated that Matthew was not the biological father of any of the three children. A heavy silence fell over the room. Kate sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands gripping the fabric tightly. At first, Matthew let out a nervous laugh, suggesting it must have been a technical error. However, the result was definitive, and the system confirmed the accuracy of the analysis. Grace was the first to break the silence, her voice tense and filled with confusion. "How is this possible?" Oliver and Lily looked stunned, their eyes slowly shifting from their mother to their father. Matthew, though trying to remain calm, couldn't hide the turmoil within. His entire world, built on his belief in his role as the head of the family, began to crumble. Suddenly, Kate stood and quickly left the room, leaving everyone in a state of utter shock. No one dared stop her or ask questions. Her behavior only intensified the tension that now hung thick in the air. Matthew remained seated in his chair, staring silently at the results glowing on the screen. He struggled to find a logical explanation, but everything seemed painfully clear. Kate knew something that no one else did. Her anxiety, which he had previously dismissed as mere exhaustion, now took on a completely different significance. From that evening onward, everything in the Rivers household changed. Tension became evident in every conversation, in every gesture. Grace tried to make sense of what was happening, preparing questions she would one day ask. Oliver and Lily felt lost, unable to grasp the meaning of this strange and unexpected revelation. Matthew felt suspicion creeping into his mind, though he didn't want to give in to it. He decided to wait for Kate to explain herself, but instead of answers, he was met with silence. None of them yet understood that this evening had marked the point of no return for their family. After the shocking discovery revealed by the DNA test, a tense silence descended over the Rivers household. Matthew struggled to find a rational explanation for the results, but none of his theories seemed convincing. Kate avoided conversations, distancing herself not only from her husband, but also from the children. Her withdrawal only heightened the sense of unease that now filled the air. Matthew, once known for his calm and composed demeanor, seemed to have lost his inner peace. Desperate for answers, he decided to contact the laboratory that had conducted the test, hoping there had been an error. A few days later, he received an official letter confirming the results. According to the report, the biological father of the three children could only be a close relative of Matthew. The only possible candidate was George Rivers, his father. This revelation left Matthew reeling. He suddenly recalled how often he had noticed Kate's tense behavior in George's presence, her nervousness and hesitant movements. He had always attributed it to George's difficult personality, but now everything seemed far more complicated. Doubts began to take root in Matthew's mind, spreading like a poisonous vine and consuming his thoughts. Over the next few days, Matthew was trapped in a constant inner dialogue. He tried to recall every small detail that might confirm or refute his suspicions. But the more he analyzed, the deeper he sank into his growing mistrust. Kate continued to avoid him, leaving the room each time he tried to speak to her. Feeling lost and confused, Matthew decided to confront George directly. He couldn't leave this question unanswered and hoped to get some clarity from his father. That evening, he went to George's house, seeing the meeting as an opportunity to regain some control over his unraveling life. George's house looked as it always did, well-maintained but cold, devoid of any warmth. When Matthew entered, he was immediately overwhelmed with a wave of anxiety. In the dimly lit room where they sat, an oppressive silence hung between them. Matthew cautiously began the conversation, but George evaded direct answers. His silence only magnified the unbearable tension. Matthew placed the DNA test results on the table in front of George and demanded an explanation. He struggled to keep his voice steady, though it trembled with anger. George, as always, remained stoic. He offered vague remarks, suggesting that every family has its secrets, but he refused to provide any concrete answers. Matthew felt his world collapsing. The betrayal he could never have imagined now stood before him in all its bitterness. He left George's house without receiving any clear answers, but his suspicions only grew stronger. Back at home, Matthew tried once more to talk to Kate, but she remained withdrawn, refusing to reveal the truth. Her silence was unbearable, and Matthew realized that he could no longer trust her or his father. The tension in the house became palpable, affecting every interaction. Grace, Oliver, and Lily noticed the shift, sensing that something serious was happening, though no one explained it to them. Matthew felt the heavy weight of suspicion pressing down on him. The faith he had preached to so many now seemed powerless in the face of the darkness that had enveloped his family. He knew that the truth, no matter how devastating, had to come to light. But he also realized that once it did, it would destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. It would destroy. The evening Matthew went to his father's house would forever be etched in his memory. The tension that had been building inside him for days finally reached its breaking point. He could no longer endure Kate's silence and George's evasiveness. The questions tormenting him demanded answers. Matthew was certain that this time the conversation with his father would not end in vague hints and riddles. George's house stood on the outskirts of town, where there were few neighbors. The night sky loomed overhead, casting a somber shadow over the house. Inside, a dim lamp illuminated the old furniture with a faint, eerie glow. George sat in his favorite armchair, his expression as calm and impenetrable as ever. Matthew entered without knocking, his steps heavy, his gaze intense. He got straight to the point. The DNA test results were placed on the table, and Matthew demanded explanations. George, as if anticipating this confrontation, showed no surprise but made no effort to speak. His face remained cold and unreadable. For several minutes, the two men stared at each other in silence, until Matthew raised his voice. He accused George of betraying him and tearing his family apart, insisting that the truth be revealed. Finally, George spoke, but his words only added fuel to the fire. He suggested that family secrets were sometimes best left buried and added that he saw no need to justify himself. This response ignited a wave of anger in Matthew. The doubts that had plagued him now solidified into certainty. The man he had once regarded as his moral guide now seemed utterly devoid of integrity. The tension in the room became unbearable. Matthew's voice grew louder, his emotions no longer contained. George attempted to maintain his composure, but his dismissive tone only intensified his son's rage. In the heat of the moment, Matthew grabbed a heavy candlestick from the table. The next instant brought tragedy. Overcome by fury, he struck George across the head. Matthew stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he had just done. But the anger that had consumed him refused to subside. Suddenly, he delivered several more blows, completely losing control of himself. When it was over, the room fell deathly silent. He stood motionless, gripping the candlestick, as the reality of what he had done slowly sank in. The world around him seemed to stop, and all he felt was emptiness. His mind, racing with chaotic thoughts, began to grasp the enormity of his actions. Realizing what he had done, Matthew panicked. He quickly surveyed the room, trying to decide what to do next. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, but one stood out above the rest. This must never come to light. He resolved to hide the crime, though deep down he doubted it was possible. Matthew wiped the candlestick and attempted to erase any signs of a struggle. He knew he had left fingerprints, but his actions were frantic and without a clear plan. All he wanted was to leave the scene as quickly as possible. Stepping out into the cold night air, Matthew felt it hit his face like a slap. He walked toward his house, overwhelmed by the horror of what he had done. His hands were still trembling, and the words kept repeating in his head. What now? When he returned home, Kate immediately noticed the stains on his clothes. Her face went pale, but she didn't dare ask what had happened. Matthew silently walked to the bathroom, washing everything off and trying to bring some clarity to his racing mind. Yet all he could feel was a growing void. This was the point of no return. From that moment on, Matthew Rivers' life was irrevocably changed, and the consequences of his actions would forever alter the fate of his family. After that night, Matthew Rivers' life spiraled into an endless vortex of anxiety, fear, and guilt. Upon returning home, He felt as if every sound in the empty hallways of the house had grown deafeningly loud, as though the world itself was screaming about his crime. Matthew tried to maintain a calm exterior, but his mind was imprisoned by relentless thoughts of what he had done. Kate, who had long sensed her husband's internal tension, immediately noticed the changes in his behavior. She refrained from asking questions, but her gaze became wary and distant. Her silence only fueled Matthew's frustration. He caught her eyes lingering on his hands or his clothes, as if she knew more than she was letting on. The children, too, felt the shift in the atmosphere at home. Grace, Oliver, and Lily, though unaware of the details, sensed that something serious had happened between their parents. Grace, the eldest, tried to keep the daily routine intact, but her worry was evident. Oliver and Lily appeared confused and frightened. They began avoiding conversations with their father, who was becoming increasingly impatient and irritable. Meanwhile, Matthew realized that his situation was growing more precarious by the day. Every unexpected phone call, every sudden knock on the door sent waves of panic through him. He began spending sleepless nights pacing the empty rooms of the house, his mind constantly replaying the events at George's house. Questions swirled relentlessly in his thoughts. Had anyone seen him enter the house? Had he left any evidence behind? One morning, just a few days after the murder, Matthew overheard Kate speaking quietly on the phone with a friend. Though her voice was low, he caught a few phrases that planted even more fear in his heart. She mentioned that one of the parishioners had been asking why George hadn't been attending Sunday services. From that moment on, Matthew knew his time was limited. In a small town like Green Lake, rumors spread quickly, and George's absence wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Matthew decided to take action. He gathered the children in the living room and, trying to sound calm, instructed them not to leave the house without his permission. He explained that there had been a string of burglaries in town and that they needed to be cautious. Grace, always perceptive of her father's moods, sensed something was off but chose not to argue. Kate remained silent throughout. Her face was pale and her hands constantly clutched at something, whether it was a towel or a cup of tea. She could sense the internal battle raging within Matthew, but her fear left her paralyzed. She didn't know whether to stay on the sidelines or try to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread in Green Lake. People noticed that George hadn't been seen for quite some time. A neighbor who lived near his house mentioned seeing lights on late one night and recalled that Matthew had visited the house that evening. Another neighbor noted that the house had been unusually quiet in the past few days, which seemed suspicious. Matthew knew it wouldn't be long before the police became involved. The thought of it pressed down on him like a weight. Everything he was trying to hide could unravel in an instant. To maintain at least some semblance of control, he decided to carry on with his pastoral duties as usual, hoping to divert attention from himself. But even during his sermons, he felt the hollowness of his words, as if the eyes of the parishioners were filled with silent questions. Every day became a struggle to preserve the appearance of normalcy. Yet with each passing moment, Matthew edged closer to losing control entirely. He knew the fragile balance he was clinging to could shatter at any moment. His life was no longer his own. It now belonged to the terrible secret he was trying so desperately to conceal. The disappearance of George Rivers began to raise suspicions within the community. A man who had always been a prominent figure at every church event and an integral part of Green Lake's life had suddenly vanished. At first, people assumed he was ill or visiting relatives, but the longer he remained absent, the more questions arose. The first to officially report his concern to the police was a parishioner who was alarmed by George's absence from several consecutive Sunday services. The authorities decided to investigate, and the case was opened. Their first step was to visit George's house. The front door was locked, and after several knocks from the officers, there was no answer. The eerie silence inside the house immediately raised their suspicions. Soon, neighbors provided statements, saying they hadn't seen George for several days. One neighbor mentioned seeing light in George's house late one evening and noticed that Matthew had entered the house that night. For the police, this became the first significant lead. Detectives decided to visit Matthew for questioning. They arrived at his house early one morning. Matthew met them at the door, his face pale but trying to maintain an outward calm. The officers asked a series of routine questions about his relationship with his father and the last time he had seen him. Matthew responded briefly and evenly, carefully concealing his inner turmoil. Kate observed the scene from the doorway of the kitchen. Her expression was tense, but she remained silent. After the police left, Matthew knew this was only the beginning. His mind raced with possible scenarios of what might come next. He realized that returning to a normal life was no longer an option. Meanwhile, the detectives pressed forward with the investigation. They obtained a warrant to search George's house, hoping to find some clues. Their search yielded results. In the living room, they found traces that someone had tried to clean up, but the marks were still faintly visible. On the table sat a candlestick with faint stains that aroused suspicion. Forensic analysis quickly confirmed that the stains were George's blood. The police began looking for evidence that could link the crime to Matthew. Fingerprints found on the candlestick matched his. This became a damning piece of evidence that left little doubt about the pastor's involvement in his father's disappearance. A few days later, the police returned to the Rivers home, this time armed with an arrest warrant. Matthew stepped onto the porch, his demeanor a shadow of what it once was. The confidence and warmth that had once made him a beloved figure in the community were gone. He didn't resist as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. Kate and the children stood silently, watching as the police led Matthew away. Grace held her younger sister's hand tightly, trying to hide her tears. Oliver stared at his father, disbelief etched on his face. This scene marked the beginning of the family's downfall, a family once considered perfect. The police took Matthew to the station, where he was interrogated for hours. Initially, he remained silent, but under the weight of the evidence and persistent questioning, he confessed. His words were cold and devoid of emotion. He described how, in a fit of rage, he had struck George and admitted he made no effort to save him afterward. George's body was found in the storage room of his house, wrapped in an old blanket. Matthew had attempted to cover up the crime, but his efforts had been in vain. The police confirmed all the details, and the case of Pastor Rivers became the main topic of conversation in Green Lake. The community, once in awe of Matthew, was now in shock over his actions. Kate and the children, who remained in the town, became the subjects of constant gossip and pity. The secrets that had long been hidden within the walls of their home were now exposed, irreversibly changing the course of the Rivers family's life. The trial of Matthew Rivers drew the attention not only of the residents of Green Lake, but of the entire state. The local press spared no detail, describing every twist of the case. The news that a pastor, who for years had preached love, peace, and family values, was now revealed as the murderer of his own father shocked the community. People who once saw him as a moral authority now watched the proceedings with a mix of disbelief and curiosity, struggling to understand how such a thing could happen. The courtroom was packed with journalists, parishioners, and curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to hear the truth about what had transpired that fateful night in George Rivers' house. The defense tried to portray Matthew as a man who had been driven to the edge by extraordinary circumstances, causing him to lose control. The attorneys emphasized that the crime was unintentional, the result of years of suppressed emotions and stress. The prosecution, on the other hand, focused on the brutality of the act. The prosecutor highlighted the devastating consequences of Matthew's actions. He argued that Matthew had acted deliberately in trying to cover up the crime and only confessed when confronted with undeniable evidence. The prosecutor stressed that no amount of hardship could justify such an act of violence. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came during Kate's testimony. She revealed that for years George had abused her both emotionally and physically. Kate recounted how she had lived in fear, unable to speak out because George had threatened to destroy their family. Her words stunned the courtroom. She explained that Matthew had been unaware of his father's true nature until the tension reached a breaking point, leading to the tragic outcome. Kate's testimony became a key element in understanding Matthew's motives. Yet even her account couldn't fully excuse his actions. The court had to weigh all the circumstances to deliver a fair judgment. Matthew's children were also called to testify, and their words deeply moved everyone present. Grace spoke of how she had always admired her father, seeing him as a model of virtue. Oliver described the strain they all felt after learning the truth from the DNA test results. Lily, the youngest, could barely speak. Her simple but heart-wrenching words echoed in the silent courtroom. "I just want everything to go back to how it was before." After weeks of hearings, the jury reached a verdict. Matthew Rivers was found guilty of second-degree murder. Despite the defense's efforts to seek leniency by highlighting the circumstances and Kate's testimony, the judge remained firm. He emphasized that while Matthew's motives might be understood, the act of violence he committed could not be justified. Matthew was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict deeply divided the community. Some believed that justice had been served, while others pitied the man they had known all their lives, seeing him as someone who had lost everything due to forces beyond his control. After the sentencing, Kate and the children left Green Lake. Their home had become a symbol of destruction, and they could no longer remain in a place where every street and every neighbor reminded them of what had happened. The community, which once revered Matthew, now tried to erase all memories of him, but the scars left by the tragedy remained. Matthew Rivers became a cautionary tale of how one event could destroy a life built over many years. His name was no longer spoken in the church where he once led sermons, and his family bore the weight of his actions and the secrets that had been hidden within their walls. The trial ended, but the ripple effects of the case were felt long after the final word was spoken. After Matthew Rivers was sentenced, his family's life fell apart like a house of cards. The Green Lake community, which once saw the Rivers family as a model of virtue, now tore them apart with gossip and judgment. People who had once stopped to greet Kate and the children on the street now avoided even making eye contact. Their home, once filled with warmth and laughter, now stood empty and silent, a heavy reminder of everything that had been lost. Kate decided to leave Green Lake almost immediately after the trial. Staying in a town where every detail reminded them of the tragedy was unbearable. She took the children and moved to a neighboring state where no one knew their story. Yet even a change of location couldn't free them from the weight of the past. Grace, the eldest daughter who had once dreamed big and planned for her future, withdrew into herself. She lost faith in people and her trust in authority figures. Her academic performance, once stellar, began to decline, and she barely spoke to her friends anymore. Grace carried the heavy burden of responsibility for her younger siblings, trying to support them while struggling with her own pain. Oliver, the middle child, reacted differently. His boundless energy turned into aggression. He distanced himself from his family, avoiding both his mother and his sister. He began spending more time away from home, often with questionable company, which led to conflicts and trouble at school. The loss of his connection to his father and the shock of his crime left a deep scar in Oliver's heart, though he masked it with indifference and defiance. Lily, the youngest, though still a child, also felt the weight of the events. Her once joyful laughter, which had filled the house, disappeared. She often woke up crying at night, seeking comfort from her mother. Lily couldn't fully understand why their family had become the subject of scorn, but she sensed that they were no longer like everyone else. Kate, despite her best efforts, couldn't restore the family's harmony. She herself was barely holding on. Losing her husband, even under such circumstances, brought her a new kind of pain and guilt. She constantly questioned whether she could have prevented what had happened, but there were no answers. Her days became an endless cycle of work to support her children, and her nights were haunted by thoughts of the past. Back in Green Lake, the fallout from the tragedy lingered. The story of Matthew Rivers became a symbol of how secrets and betrayal could destroy even the strongest of families. The townspeople often brought up his name, debating how someone who had guided others toward spiritual light could fall so far. The church where Matthew had once preached lost much of its congregation. Many parishioners found it hard to trust the clergy after the scandal, and the building itself seemed to have lost its former radiance. Yet some in the community viewed the story differently. To them, Matthew was a victim, a man who broke under the weight of his father's hidden sins. They wondered if he could have acted differently and whether he deserved sympathy despite the terrible act he committed. These debates continued to divide the town even years after the trial. Meanwhile, Matthew, sitting in prison, gradually lost his connection to the outside world. His imprisonment was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. His own thoughts were his harshest judges. He constantly replayed that night in his mind, asking himself the same question over and over. Could I have stopped myself? But the answer remained elusive. This story served as a warning to many. It demonstrated how a single hidden truth could turn a family's life into ruins. It reminded people that secrets, if left unspoken, could inflict damage far beyond what anyone might expect. And even those who seemed unshakable could collapse under the weight of betrayal and pain. The Rivers family never recovered. Their story left a mark on each of them, a mark that remained visible even years later. Green Lake, a town once known for its tranquility, would forever be remembered as the place where one family lost everything.